Just like we did for the other activity this week, we're going to start with just refreshing our memory, writing down the steps for solving by quadratic formula. Like I said, a great study, I don't know what you want to call it, method, skill, how I would study, knowing that the test is largely based on knowing the steps versus just the final answer. I would, on a blank piece of paper, try to write out all the steps from memory and then see how close I was. So, solving by quadratic formula is what we're going to be practicing today. So the only one we didn't have like an extra activity for was for completing the square. However, when we did that lesson, I know we wrote out the steps. So like you could still just do those steps, memorize them, do some of those examples. Um, but uh, there's like three major methods. Quadratic formula, solving by factoring, solving by completing the square. There's also just like isolating x, of course, but this is one of the three major methods I use. So if we're solving by quadratic formula, what's the very first step? What do I need to make sure of? Usually for each method, it has to do with the form. So make sure we're paying attention. Let's stop looking at our screens. Let's look at my screen and writing down what I wrote down, not drawing or anything else. For solving by quadratic formula, what's the very first thing I need to make sure of? I'm going to tell you. Grab notes. Then at time. Okay, we'll give a hint. Something with the form. So step one would be to make sure it is in standard form. And what else? Make sure it's in standard form and what else? Good, and set equal to 0. So very similar to quadratic solving by factoring. Both of these methods want it in standard form, set equal to 0. This time I will put the reminder that standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. Because I mean, it's kind of important for factoring that you know what a, b, and c are always in relation to the formula. But with quadratic formula, it's especially important. You have to make sure that's actually going to be our next step. You have to make sure that you can easily identify your A, B, and C. You can only do that once it's in standard form set equal to 0. So by the way, when we did the factoring flow chart, that was a flow chart because there was like all these things you needed to ask yourself, and based on what it was, that took you down like a different path. This is the same every time. That's why I'm making it step 1, step 2. After we identify A, B, and C, what do we do next? For solving by quadratic formula, what do we do after we identify our A, B, and C? Put it into the formula. So plug into the quadratic formula. Am I making you memorize the formula? No, this is the only formula all year that I do not force you to memorize. Some other maybe like higher level classes do. Like I was talking to one of my, actually I don't know if she's a freshman and sophomore, but she probably takes geometry right now. And she was saying that her teacher showed her a quadratic formula song. And I was like, what do you need the song for? And she said to like know the different parts of the formula. And I was like, oh, okay, so you have to actually memorize it. You guys don't. You just have to know these steps for how to properly use it. In college, I had to memorize it. It's the only time I ever remember having to memorize it. But it is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And I would put like a little note to yourself in this step. Make sure you use what when you plug in? Parentheses. It is so important. It will make a difference when you're calculating if you don't use parentheses. And then your last step after you plug it in would be to simplify and solve for both cases or solutions. So there's usually two. Sometimes there is only one solution. Sometimes there are no solutions. But most of the time there are two. And it comes from that plus or minus. So you solve it once when it's plus there, and you solve it once when it's minus there, and that's how you get your two answers. In that formula, you should recognize certain parts of it. So you don't necessarily have to highlight this, but for example, when you get to certain questions on your test that have you comparing like line of symmetry, for example, or identifying it, this is our line of symmetry formula. The negative b over 2a equal to x, that tells us our line of symmetry. The part that's not highlighted has a special name. What do we call the b squared minus 4ac? I will be referring to it when we do an example. I always put it in my calculator. What's it called? Probability. That. The b squared minus 4ac has a special name. What is it? Starts with a D. Notes on it if I was here. And I refer to it a lot. I say I always put my blank in the calculator. What is it? All right, well, let's practice using our notes. Let's take it out for lesson, what was it? 17. Yes, now? It is the discriminants. All right, so when I say, oh, I always put the discriminant in the calculator, which I recommend you do as well, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just what's under the square root symbol. I only put the square root symbol if I need to know what the square root of it is. Sometimes I don't. All right, so that discriminant can tell you if there's two solutions, one solution, or no solution. So most of the time, you are square rooting a positive number. No matter if it's a perfect square or not, you'll always have two solutions if you're square rooting a positive number. If you're square rooting 0, how many solutions will you have? 1, because there's no plus or minus 0. It's just 0, right? There's not a positive 0 and a negative 0 is just 1. And then if you're square rooting a negative, how many solutions do you have? 0. You have no solution. Let's not confuse it. You have no solution when you're trying to square root a negative. At that point, you would just stop and say there's no solution. All right, so that is the formula, how it's useful to help answer our questions. We're going to do an example. Okay. That's all it says. Sweetie, now. Okay. Bye. Kennedy, you're going home. Okay, so example, I'm just gonna make one up because luckily for this one, you can use it no matter what. And for certain problems, like you'll see on your constructed response, when you have to make an equation for the situation and solve it, a quadratic formula might be more desirable than like factoring or completing the square. So say that we had big numbers similar to this, 40x squared minus 25x equals 1000 plus 30x. All right, so I just made one up off the top of my head. I wanted it to have it where you have to make it equal to 0, because I see on your activity, you do have to make some of them equal to 0 first. So first step, put it in standard form and set it equal to 0. It doesn't really matter what side you make 0. However, just for like my personal preference, anytime I can have the x squared be 1, like with the number in front of it, I mean, anytime I can have the a be 1 or the a be positive, I usually will go for that. So I'll decide to move these two terms to the other side. But it's up to you, whatever you think is easier to move. How do I cancel out the 1000? And then whatever you do on one side of the equal sign, you do to the other side. Normally, I would line it up with its like term. It doesn't have a like term over here. So I'm just going to put it still on the other side, but I normally would like to line it up with its like term. So that'll cancel out on the right. How do I get rid of the 30x? Subtract it. So in both situations, we ended up having to subtract it. There can be some times where you're having to add to cancel it out. Like if it was negative, I have to add to make it 0. This one I have to subtract, and wherever you go on one side of the equal sign, do to the other side. So that'll cancel this out. So now my right side of my equation is 0. My left side, combine any like terms. Try to put it in standard form. So I'm going to write my x squared term first. There's nothing to combine that with. My x term, I have to combine what's negative 25x minus 30x. Good. And then this one didn't have a like term, but we moved it from the right. So we have to, put it there. It didn't go away. All right, so everyone understand that step, putting it in standard form, setting it equal to 0. Now, my next step is to identify my A, B, and C. So table 5, what's my A? 40, table 6, what's my B? Did you say 55? Negative 55 is correct. And table 8, what's my C? Good. All right, so If there's no sign written in front of it, it's assumed to be positive. But you always keep the sign that's in front of each term, right? So this is definitely a negative 55. This is definitely a negative 1,000. Has to be that when we're plugging it in. And I do this step. Even though I'm a math teacher and I'm pretty good at math, I still write out A equals this, C equals that, C equals that. So that when I plug it in, it's just really easy. I'm doing negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2 times A, right? And every time I'm saying the letter, I'm looking back at what my letter equaled, putting that in parentheses every time you're plugging in. So again, that's negative B plus or minus B squared minus 4AC over 2A. All right, everyone good so far? I would not try to combine anything in that step, even though some of the stuff you could probably easily do. And just leave it like that, make sure I plugged it in right. And then in my simplifying step, then I'll start combining some things. So like what happens to this negative 55? Becomes positive. My discriminant, what's under the square root symbol, I'm going to put in the calculator always. I never try to do that at all by myself. And my denominator, the 2 times 40, I know that is 80. So that I can do easily. But the rest I put in my calculator. And you have to use a parenthesis or else it will tell you the wrong answer. So negative 55 in parentheses, then squared, minus 4 times 40 times negative 1,000. All right, and that's a big number. It may or may not be a perfect square, but today, if you look at the answer key later, it's taped to that wall. It only has answers, so you need to show work to get points. But you'll see that on that answer key, it's in decimal form. So that kind of makes it a little easier. You don't have to simplify any radicals today. Plus, if you were talking about a real world situation, you probably want the decimal anyway. But this is what's under my square root symbol. It's a positive number, so I know that I'll have 2 answers later on. And the way that I get those 2 answers, I'm also going to use my calculator for this part, is I'm going to do 55 plus the square root of that number. So 163,025 over 80. And that's one of my decimal answers. So let's just round it 2 spots, unless it tells us otherwise. And that's one of my decimal answers. And then the other one I get from changing this plus to a minus, because that's where the plus or minus is normally, right in front of the square root symbol. And then my other answer is negative 4.36 rounded. And that would be like how you do your activity today. You get your 2 answers, and today it's okay to put the decimal. Now, if this was on my constructed response, like I said, you probably want to do the quadratic formula since these numbers are really big up here. Yes, there's a GCF and then you could still factor, but it would still be hard to figure out what multiplies to a really big number and adds to a number. So that's why factoring might not be ideal for if the numbers are really large like that. And then if this was on the constructed response for a real world problem, say we were talking about like time in seconds or something, then this answer really wouldn't make sense, right? So even though there's normally two solutions, I would go to that one if we're talking about like time, or if we're talking about money. It might not make sense to have the negative answer. All right, but for your activity today, we do want both if there is two instances. Okay, so any questions? You warmed up? All right, so similar to the last activity, I have this spread over today and Monday. I'm gonna make you turn it in no matter what today. I don't want you doing it as homework. I'll give it back to you on Monday, and then at the end of class on Monday, you'll be turning it in for an actual grade. Your homework over the weekend is to maybe redo and resubmit some of the other things that were low scoring. Anything that's a project grade should be prioritized. Then you should be doing any other missing work, the study guides. I do have tutoring today after school until 3. And then I have Saturday Academy tomorrow from 8 to 10 in the commons. So lots of help right now that you can get. And remember, these are the last like tutoring extra help days. I'm not adding any more. I'm a very busy person. So make sure like if your grade has been on the borderline, that you're doing everything you can to get the grade you want. I'm going to scroll up to the steps again. Any questions?